Thanks. It's a real pleasure to come over. I was saying earlier that since I arrived at UCSD about 1.5 years ago, people keep saying, "Oh, are you doing things with Design Lab?" And I keep going, I don't even know the colleague who's in the office next door, so no, not yet. But it's really great to start to come over here and get to meet so many of you and to see the cool things that are happening here, because I think there is a very tight connection between ethics, design, trust, and all the things that we ideally would like to have when we think about responsible AI. And so what I want to try and do today is talk at least a little bit. This is going to be a bit of a high level because I wasn't sure exactly what people were going to be coming knowing. So I'm going to be talking about sort of how could we have ethical AI? What does that even exactly mean? I will also give the caveat that I could go on and on for 10, 12 hours, and I don't want to keep you here for that length of time. But so I'm happy to be sort of pretty open-ended in terms of questions. So if you think, wow, here's this question I thought was going to get addressed in the talk, and I don't address it, please do put it through Slido or questions or whatever, because I'm sure that it's my own ignorance of what people would want to hear about that led me to not include that. So I take it this is perhaps unnecessary, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that in the last really in the last about 30 years, but especially in the last 10, there's been this sort of transformation that's occurred societally in terms of the ways in which we now have an enormous number of AI technologies that are really providing real benefit, that are helping people in deep and meaningful ways. And of course, we also have had, in the last 10 years, any number of examples of transformations that have deeply harmed people. People being kept in jail longer than in prison longer than they should. People denied unjustly access to benefits that they do deserve, even to the point of AI systems that kill people. And I don't mean that as hyperbole. That is, in fact, the case. Tesla's full self-driving mode has killed people. Uber ATG's self-driving vehicle in Tempe, Arizona, about 3 years ago, there was a fatality, and it was because of the AI system. Now, it might be unavoidable. We might think all things being equal, an autonomous vehicle would be better than having human drivers. Human drivers are pretty terrible, right? But nonetheless, we have to acknowledge that there have been very real harms. Those harms have not fallen equally across all communities and all people. And we need to think seriously about what we should do. And so what we find, if we look at the sort of landscape over the last 5 to 7 years, what we're seeing is increasingly things like, in the US federal government, an executive order. Orders, think of that in quotes. Executive orders often don't come with any penalty if you fail to follow them, but telling the federal government, the US government, that every agency that uses artificial intelligence must do so using trustworthy AI. That in fact, they're not allowed to use AI that's not trustworthy. You might wonder what trustworthy means. You should. That's something that is only sort of spelled out in EO 13960. We have the OECD, the sort of major economies in the world. They got together, those governments, and almost all have signed on to a set of AI principles that, all AI must be human, must have human-centered values and fairness. Why those get lumped together, not entirely clear. But what we see is we see governments, both individually and collectively, indicating, signaling that they are committed that we are going to have trustworthy and responsible AI systems. That we're going to have AI systems that help, not those ones that harm. We see companies signaling this all over the place. Microsoft makes a very big deal out of their Office of Responsible AI. I will say, Microsoft is perhaps the tech company doing this best. So I don't mean to put them up here as ha, let's laugh at them. They're trying to take it seriously. But they're investing millions of dollars. We have companies like Deloitte, the large consulting company, that are selling to others. You really should use trustworthy AI, and they're going to trademark trustworthy AI. I'm not sure how that one got through. But they're going to trademark trustworthy AI, and they're going to sell to other companies that they just hire us, and we'll come in and make sure your AI is trustworthy. This whole movement, in fact, I think in some ways gets a sort of, has come to a bit of a very important moment, a kind of pivot moment with the release last fall of the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights here in the United States, coming out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which was, a multi-year effort to figure out a plan for what rights we as, in this case, Americans, but we're already seeing in other countries that governmental, especially legislative entities are starting to think, well, hey, if this is the right Bill of Rights for the US, now notice a blueprint for, it's not actually a Bill of Rights, but if this is the right thing for the US, maybe it's the right thing for us. Okay, so we're seeing this real movement happening in the last 5 to 7 years, both coming in a kind of bottom up, we might think from companies saying, we really need to do this. Not necessarily because it's the ethical thing to do, but because it's commercially viable as well. And we're seeing pressures coming from legislators and regulators. You'll notice I don't have things up there about boycotts because we're not really seeing that. We are not seeing consumers flex their muscle. It is not yet clear that the investments, for example, that companies are making is making a difference. But nonetheless, there's a reason that almost every day, certainly every week, LA Times, New York Times, Guardian, you name it, there are articles about ethical issues having to do with AI. Most recently, of course, it's ChatGPT. Right? That's the one that's been in the news. It's the one that everyone is worried about is, okay, is this going to be the death of civilization? No, it's not. Is this going to be the death of academia? Are we as educators, just give up? There's no way we can ever assess people properly. No, I mean, I put every single one of the prompts that I use in my classes into ChatGPT, and trust me, ChatGPT is not getting an A in my classes. Okay, it's not even getting a C for most of my classes. Sorry for those of you who are in one of my classes, you're now forewarned. Don't use ChatGPT to try and answer what the prompts are, okay? So we have all of these pressures coming. There's all this activity and all this energy. And what I want to try and do, the main focus of what I wanted to try to do is to talk about how we ought to be doing more ethical AI. How should we be approaching these problems? What does it look like? Because just because there's a lot of energy doesn't mean that it's directed in fruitful ways, doesn't mean that it's going towards anything that's actually going to be useful, and more importantly, anything that would lead us towards the kind of responsible and trustworthy AI that presumably all of us do want, right? I want to have trustworthy AI. Does that mean that I want transparent AI? That I want explainable AI? What is it that I want is a question that people don't usually ask. How do we get it is a question that's not usually asked. So that's some of what I want to try to do here in the next little while. So I think it's useful when we think about sort of the approaches to trying to build more ethical AI systems. I think of it in sort of 4 clusters. There are principles. We can do it through the advocacy of particular algorithms, through looking at the behaviors of the systems, through trust test and evaluation, through audit and compliance mechanisms. Or we could do it through looking at practices, through what I'll refer to as translational ethics, and I'll explain why in a little bit. You can guess, based on the title of the talk, where I fall of these 4, but let me take a moment to sort of explain why the other 3, I think, are each individually interesting and useful, but guaranteed to not get us to what we want. So probably the one that at least 5 years ago was kind of everywhere were principles. So Google, after the Project Maven fiasco, comes out with their AI 7 principles for ethical AI. Microsoft has a very clear set of AI principles. The US Department of Defense has 5 principles for ethical and responsible uses of artificial intelligence, right? So even a Defense Department is saying, oh, we got to have our ethical AI principles. In fact, it got to the point that there were articles that talked about what are the principles guiding the principles, because there were literally hundreds of sets of principles for ethical AI that were being promoted. And so people said, well, what are the commonalities amongst all of these things? Now, the fundamental problem that we've found as a community with looking to principles is that, first and foremost, they have almost no impact on practice. If you actually look at, say, the DoD principles, one of them is that a system must be governable. Governable means that basically you need to be able to shut it off if it's misbehaving. But what does it mean to shut off a facial recognition system? Is it pulling the plug? Is it saying I'm going to ignore the outputs of it? Does it mean imposing a filter that blurs people's faces temporarily? Is it changing the threshold required for a classification? All of these could potentially be considered a form of governance. And yet the principle doesn't tell you anything about that. And so it's become this mantra now. There are just endless numbers of workshops and conferences that are about how do we go from principles to practice? And the reason is because the principles actually don't do very much. They don't constrain us, they don't guide us, and don't tell us how to get to where we want to be. And moreover, in order to have principles that apply everywhere, we have principles that are largely context insensitive. They aren't tuned to the particular uses or the particular challenges that people are facing. We find that they are written in such a high level that most of the interpretation is left to the teams. So even within an organization, people have done studies looking at places like, say, Google, and asking, do different teams interpret the principles in the same way? And it will probably surprise no one in this room to hear that the answer is no, they don't. Different teams in exactly the same company, given exactly the same text and training, interpret the principles in radically different and incompatible ways. And so for all of these kinds of reasons, we end up with these things being built that, I mean, I suppose in theory, they're probably better than if we didn't have the principle at all. The principles do provide a kind of aspirational goal. They do allow people to have the freedom, maybe in a design meeting, to say, hey, have we thought about issues of fairness? Where a decade ago, if you were in a design meeting at one of these companies, you said, we should think about fairness, people would have said, fair what? I mean, fair, everyone gets access to our system, that's fairness, right? And so, you know, in that sense, I think the principles, I don't want to say that they have been ineffective or that they have not made a difference, but we're not getting to where we want to be solely using principles, right? And I think, in fact, the general, I'm generalizing for many people, but I think that this is correct. The general view is that sort of principles have run their course. We've now been able to change the conversation sufficiently that people understand we have to do better and some of the parameters of how we have to do better. And now the question is, all right, what do we do? And so the next move that people have done is they've said, well, let's just hard code ethics into algorithms. Okay, so I had a colleague at Carnegie Mellon that when I first started talking to this individual in computer science and robotics about, you know, do you realize the ethical issues that your systems are running into and are implicating? And this person looked at me and said, well, you figure out the ethics, tell me what to do, and I'll code it. And I said, it doesn't work that way. And this person looked at me and said, well, find a way to make it work that way. Because if you can't tell me what to code, I'm just going to keep doing things. Okay. And so what we find, you know, many of you may remember a few years back, there was a great amount of ink spilled or electrons wasted around the trolley problem, right? This question of if you have a self-driving car and it has to get into an accident, should it, you know, what should it do? Who should it sacrifice? Most of that was a misuse of the trolley problem thought experiment from Philippa Foot in philosophy. Most of it was really bad social science in terms of the surveys that were run to try and figure out what people wanted. And most of it could never possibly have been implemented in any autonomous vehicle on the market or that will be on the market in the next 20 years, right? So it was a lot of hot air that didn't really do very much. But I think it's informative because it spoke to a moment where people said, what we need is we need our algorithms to explicitly encode our values, explicitly encode what we have in mind in terms of ethics. And so you also find this when people saying, what we need is we need to do large-scale surveys, and then we'll do basically voting theory, social choice aggregation methods to figure out what our algorithms ought to do. And the idea was we just bake the ethics into the algorithm. It has to be ethical if it explicitly is making the decision or giving a recommendation in line with what the philosophers told us is ethics. The problem is, of course, and probably will hit home to many people here in a design space, when we think about human values, when we think about the things that matter to people, many of those, most of those cannot be converted into an algorithm. This, I'll just mention, it's one of these things happy to go into in the question period. This is the biggest problem right now with the whole field of what is called fair machine learning, or fair ML. Right now, you have an enormous culture, sub-community of folks that are trying to turn bias and fairness into algorithms, trying to turn it into a mathematical representation. And the fundamental problem is that the human values of fairness, lack of bias, justice, are not things that can be entirely converted into algorithms. They cannot be entirely mathematized. The statistical skew in my algorithm's predictions might be a signal that there is bias, might be a signal that there's some unfairness or injustice, but it is not constitutive of it. And so what we're seeing, in fact, in FairML is exactly this effort to convert things into, let's just hard code the ethics into our algorithms. It's also a problem because the whole point of using AI systems in many contexts is that they understand the world differently than us. We want systems that can discover patterns and features that we would fail to recognize. So it's actually a really good thing in many cases that AI systems don't understand the world exactly as we do, but then that means that trying to impose our ethical frameworks, in as much as we humans explicitly, consciously think about ethics at all anyway, that any effort to do that is inevitably going to fail. Right? And we can think about this in the self-driving car case pretty straightforwardly. Most of the trolley problem experiments or studies were done on things like if you have to trade off two older individuals against one younger individual, should we do that? Self-driving cars understand the world. They perceive the world in terms of rectangles that have their own movement trajectories and that my trajectory is not permitted to intersect. Right? None of the sensors on anything that is in design, development, testing for an autonomous vehicle, none of them can detect the age of a pedestrian. Right? So it's sort of pointless to say, oh, the decision procedure should take that into account. It can't. That information is simply not available. Now, maybe you're saying that we should design our systems to do that. That's a whole other set of arguments. Okay? So algorithms are just not the right locus where we should be looking to make sure we get ethical issues in. We also might think about testing and evaluation. So maybe what we do is we say, you know what? All that matters when we're thinking about harms, this is an oversimplification, but you might think all that matters for harms is actual harms. Right? So what we should worry about is, are people being hurt by these systems? Are the systems causing injustice? Are they unfairly causing harms to particular communities or particular individuals? So you might say what we should really do is we should do audit and certification. This is now, right now, you're seeing a huge amount of this. So, and a lot of it is coming. So in the European Union, there's the Draft AI Act, which is likely to be enacted sometime in the first half of this year. It requires audits of all high-risk AI systems. The audits are written in very high-level language. It's not entirely clear what will count as an audit, but it's going to be required. In New York City, there is a law that went into effect on January 1, though enforcement has been delayed, that requires that if you're using an automated decision support system for hiring in employment context, say a resume screener, that the company that's offering that technology or using that technology must conduct an audit to determine whether there is bias in the resume screener or other whatever exactly it's doing for the automated decision support. What's that audit supposed to be? The law does not tell us. So basically we have companies sort of going, well, I guess we'll come up with something, but there's not clear guidance, right? So that's one of the challenges, but it's happening right now, is we're seeing an increasing move towards audit and compliance requirements and regulations. The challenge, of course, is that frequently, as we know from anyone who's ever had to develop any sort of standard, performance standard, is you have to specify things to a degree that you often are not able to. We often don't know enough about the context of use and deployment of AI systems to be able to fully specify what performance we expect or demand. In general, audit systems are really good for what in computer science we refer to as a closed world system. Closed world system is essentially one where with a finite number of descriptions, finite number of features, I can describe everything there is about the system. So board games are closed worlds. right? If I tell you where all the pieces are on the chessboard and who has the next move, I have described everything there is to describe about the state of the game. Whether the pieces are made of plastic or wood or it's all in our brains, that doesn't matter, right? That's irrelevant to the gameplay, okay? Open worlds, by contrast, are what we all live in. There is no finite description of this room that suffices to tell us everything that matters from a causal, ethical, legal, what have you perspective, right? And if you think, well, we've got the description, it's like, well, but we also need to include the fact that there's not a meteorite about to, slam in and destroy this building. And you go, well, of course there's not. It's like, okay, but that was something that we had to describe. If I didn't tell you that, you might say, well, are we all going to be, still sitting here in 30 seconds? And the answer is, I don't know. Because you didn't tell me if there's a meteorite coming, right? It's a very old problem in AI known as the frame problem, which is how do you know what stays stable and what changes? And in an open world, it's very hard to know. And when you try and do test, compliance, audit, you are trying to close the world as much as you can. That's why we think we can do things like verification and audit on algorithms, but it's really hard to do verification and audit on algorithm use, because now humans are in the mix. Now the world is in the mix and all of the complexity that comes with it. It's also the case that most of these systems that are being built for compliance or that are being proposed are one size fits all. And that's a huge problem because we know that the values of one community are very different from the values of another community. And so we need to think about not only questions of what are the values, but we need to think about how those values vary across communities. And just as one more problem is if we needed more, test and evaluation systems set up for Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law is something that is a good measure when you use it to make decisions quickly will cease to be a good measure, right? It's gaming. Goodhart's law is just people will game the system if you allow them, okay? So standardized tests used to actually be a good predictor of first-year performance of undergraduates. Since the mid-'80s, they are no longer. Or they've gotten much, much worse over time to the point that they are now pretty close to useless as a measure of almost anything other than socioeconomic status. Right? So things like SAT scores and these kinds of things. It did used to actually be a good measure. Maybe it was a measure of something that we don't care about, namely first-year academic performance. But they did measure something. Now they don't, right? That's Goodhart's law. Why? Because people learned, well, I can get admitted to college if I study for it. So they learned to study for that thing rather than acquiring the cognitive preparation, the skills and knowledge that actually are why folks who scored well on those exams tended to do better in the first year of college, okay? So we have all of these three approaches. These are all being put out. There's a reason that I have given all of these real world examples because these are the things that get a lot of the headlines. I want to argue that, in fact, we need to do things differently. And we need to do things in a way that is much less glamorous. It doesn't get you the headlines, but actually has been shown to make an effective difference. And in some ways, what I'm going to be advocating is we need to do better design. And we need to use design methods. They are an important piece of what I'm going to be talking about. They're not all of it, but they are an important piece, right? So in some sense, I am, growing up in the Midwest, a phrase that we would use is preaching to the choir. For those who are more secular, as I now am, it's, I guess it used to be bringing coals to Newcastle would be the UK version of this, right? It may be that most of you are going to look at the next few slides and say, well, yeah. But I think it's also important to see that there's an enormous role to be played for design that I think is not necessarily being recognized right now in the field of people who are talking about responsible AI and trustworthy AI. Now, to do that, I want to try and argue for something that I call translational ethics. Now, I omitted a slide on what is ethics because I didn't want to necessarily go down that rabbit hole. I will simply say, I think it's people in tech spaces usually think about ethics in one of two ways. They either think ethics means compliance. So you say ethics and they go, oh, the lawyers are coming in the room. It's like, no, that's not what ethics is. Or you say ethics and they think, oh, you're the fun police. You're the person who's going to come in and tell me, I can't do this really cool thing that's going to be awesome when it works. And I go, well, no, I'm not going to do that either. And they say, well, then what is ethics? Is ethics this thing that I have to have a PhD? Because nobody's taught me ethics before. And my response is, no, ethics is something you all already do. Everybody in this room is an ethicist. Ethics is fundamentally, in my view, about asking two questions. What should we value? Where value is what matters to us. It matters to me that I am a good instructor to my students. Matters to me that I'm a good citizen of San Diego now. Matters to me that I'm a good parent, right? So what should we value? And given what we value, how should we act in ways that advance and support those values? So if I say that I value being a good parent, what ought I do? Okay, so it's fundamentally, for me, ethics is fundamentally about values. It's about what matters to us as individuals, about what matters to us as communities, and of course, the many identities that we all have, right? I could have done an entire talk about the complexities of values, but that's really what ethics is fundamentally about at its core. What are and should be our values, and how should we act, whether through technology, through our own actions, in ways that advance those values? Now, to explain what I mean by translational ethics, I want to start by giving an analogy, which is the analogy is to the entire field of translational medicine. Okay, so translational medicine is essentially the idea that we can't just go from a biology lab to clinical practice. There's an enormous gap there. Even if I understand everything that there is to know about, the genetic regulatory networks of certain kinds of cancer cells, in order to go to clinical practice, we need extra research. We need substantive research to translate from the basic biomedical knowledge to clinical practice. Now, I want to emphasize that this actually, I talked in terms of basic and applied. It's not really, basic and applied is not the right way to think about what translation is about. It's not about going from basic to applied. Because the whole point is to say, actually, basic and applied is not two ends of a spectrum, and translation is not getting from one to the other. And here I find it very useful to think about a distinction that Alan Baddeley, the memory researcher, made in 1978, a paper, which is the distinction between, this is updated language, it's not exactly this terminology, but applied basic research. Right? So how do I take what's been done in a lab and sort of apply it in real world contexts? You might think of this from a data science perspective as, I built a model on my computer sitting in my office. How do I actually get it to work in the world? But we also need to have what Baddeley referred to as basic applied research, which is you start with the complexities of the context and use cases, and you do very foundational research. So user studies are a nice example of basic applied research. It's basic research in the sense that you're not, going out and finding, people in their true, real world contexts. User studies are often done in somewhat artificial contexts, but you're trying to do it with all of the complexity of the applied product in mind. Okay, so Baddeley drew this distinction. He said, look, it's not basic versus applied. It's, do you start with the hyper-simplified version where you can just understand a few of the relevant causal things, that's basic research, and then push out, that would be applied basic? Or do you start with the complexity of the problem that we have in the world and say, all right, I got to simplify it a little bit because I can't make sense of the world in all of its endless complexity. And that's basic applied. Okay, so we can think about it as coming from these both directions, and the point of translational is we need to do both. Now, I want to argue that we should have translational AI ethics, which is to say we need to think about how to translate between basic ethical advances and the technological practices in which we engage. Okay? And I really do mean it that it needs to be in both directions. I think that we as ethicists and philosophers need to rethink some of our foundational ethical concepts in light of the ways that technology is transforming our interactions with one another and our interactions with ourselves. And so we need both applied basic research, where we start with sort of basic ideas in, I just, would think about ethics. What is the notion of autonomy? Right? That's a fundamental ethical concept. People have been studying it for 3,500 years at least, maybe 4,000, depending on which traditions you look at and how you interpret some of them. Autonomy is a pretty big deal. where you might have thought it was a well-mined terrain, there wasn't much left to say. And the devices that probably every one of you has in your pocket has changed the notion of autonomy, namely smartphones. Smartphones radically change, actually, what it is to be autonomous in important ways. Right? So we need to rethink some of these basic concepts, rethink basic concepts of social connection and social community. And of course, AI. We need to rethink what algorithms we build. How do we have loss functions that we optimize that actually incorporate some approximation to a human value? And of course, we need to go in the other direction. We need to ask, if you are a 23-year-old data science graduate and you're working for Vons. Grocery stores are major employers of data science grads these days. Why? Because they've got massive amounts of purchasing data and they need to know what to do with it. And so how can we change the practices of the person who works for Vons to have them be able to do their job differently so that they don't unintentionally continue to perpetuate food deserts? Because what's the simple thing to do if you've got purchase history? Well, let's predict what's going to be bought at this store again. And if you've never provided high quality produce to a particular store, guess what the purchasing record will show? Nobody's ever bought high quality produce from that particular location. And that's how we get the perpetuation of food deserts. Not because people are being malicious or they're racist, but because they're just not thinking about things. And so how do we change those practices? So what I want to sort of spend a little bit of time here talking about, and then we'll transition to the Q&A, is what would this look like? What do I mean when I talk about novel practices? And what are some examples of how things are being done differently now? So as an example, one of the things that's happening is there's now an increased movement to change the way that we do training and education, both in humanities and social sciences and in technology. Perhaps the most visible instance of this is what's known as the Embedded Ethics Program, started at Harvard, now at Stanford, where what they do is basically they embed ethics in every single CS class. That is the goal, that every single computer science class at Harvard, Stanford, will have a significant ethical component woven all the way through it. You're doing a class on databases, guess what? There's going to be issues of privacy that are a part of every single assignment. Okay? Those programs are now, I think the Harvard one was started about 6 years ago. They've had 4 postdocs every single year. And they still haven't succeeded in getting it woven through every single class. So there's a scale problem there, which is how do we scale it to other places? How do we translate what is learned in the context of Harvard to other places? How do we translate that to an HBCU? How do we translate that to an institution outside of the United States? These are hard questions. How do we build interdisciplinary skills? How do we have not only computer scientists understanding ethics, but how do we have ethicists who understand enough about AI that they can actually be in a room and collaborate? How do we teach collaboration? Universities are actually, I think, remarkably bad. Design groups notwithstanding, are for the most part terrible about teaching people how do you collaborate, about teaching people the skills and knowledge they need to collaborate. I collaborate regularly with economists. I could not make an economic model to, the proverbial to save my life. I mean, I suppose if I had to, I'd find a way to. I cannot do economics, and yet I can collaborate with them. I know a lot of people who can collaborate with computer scientists and cannot write a line of code. I also know a lot of people who should be collaborating with computer scientists and aren't able to, who can write a line of code. They can write code, but they don't understand how to think about the world from the perspective of computer science. And computer scientists who are ethicists at heart, but they don't understand how to talk with and communicate with people who study ethics, people who can actually answer these questions. So there's a deep challenge that we have on the training and education side, which is how do we start to do a better job of teaching people the skills that they need to collaborate across disciplinary boundaries, which is not go take an intro class in econ, right? Telling people to take an intro class in a discipline does not enable them to collaborate across. Typically, intro classes are designed for people who are going to go on and get a degree or go on and learn how to do. But collaboration is not being able to do what your collaborator does. It's understanding what they do, even if you cannot do it yourself. Those are the best collaborations, or when you have a group of people and none of them can do what the others in the group can do, but yet they all understand. And so we are seeing right now the growth of a number of innovative ideas. We're trying to pilot some of them over in HDSI here at UCSD on how do we teach people how to collaborate across these boundaries. And how do we ensure that people are going out in the workforce just expecting and understanding, of course I'm going to be able to collaborate with an ethicist when I go to work at a company. Why wouldn't I? We're already starting to see some of this in showing up in grant programs coming out of groups like the agencies like the NSF. They're starting to talk very seriously. There was the whole movement of team science, and now that's making its way back in terms of interdisciplinary collaboration. And saying it's not just that we're going to fund, a sociologist and a computer scientist to work on a project. They also have to talk about how they're going to collaborate and how they're going to build the next generation's collaborative skills. We need to rethink the practices by which we develop AI systems. This is one where there's actually been a lot of the work. A lot of the translating principles to practice work has been in this area. Things like data sheets, model cards, methods that I've been involved in that we refer to as ethical triage, which is basically, if you're a data scientist, how do you know when to pick up the phone and call somebody? If I'm optimizing server loads, I probably don't need to worry too much about the ethical issues. Maybe I would in certain contexts. If I'm building a face recognition system to do access control in a children's hospital, yes, please call somebody. And that was actually one of the examples that prompted us to build this tool, is because a group thought, well, we've got these data. What could go wrong? And thankfully, there was somebody in the room who said, a lot of things could go very wrong. And so what we wanted to build was a tool for people who may not have had the kinds of training and education that are needed to know when they should call, which is something that happens in most organizations right now on the legal side all the time. People are told, if you work with data, you're trained. Here are the questions you ask. And if you answer yes to any of these questions, pick up a phone and call a lawyer. Because they may tell you that there's no compliance issues, but we want to make sure. And so our project was, how do we build a tool that in under 3 minutes, you can figure out whether you should pick up the phone and call an ethicist? That's the sense of triage. And crucially, it had better be a tool that it's fine, no big deal if it has false positives. It's not a problem if you pick up the phone and call somebody and they tell you, no, you're good, it's okay. It had better have no false negatives. And we've been able to do it. And it's now in use at 2 different hospitals. They are using this as a tool in their data analytics team to figure out when something they want to do might be ethically problematic. And so what we're seeing, and audits, I think, fall into this, especially because if you know you're going to get audited down the road, you can design for it. That's what happens in financial technology all the time. Financial tech, fintech, is subject to significant amounts of audit and compliance. And so what do the people in fintech do? They design to pass the compliance tests. Now, that has risks, Goodhart's law. You design to pass the test, not to be a stable technology. Nonetheless, it is rethinking things. It's asking, what is it we could actually operationally test so that people can design in better ways? And that leads to rethinking the kinds of design and development processes that we have. We're going to need to rethink governance. We're going to need to think about how do we translate our ethical ideas about the importance of recourse, right? So if there's an adverse event that an algorithm says, no, you don't get that loan, how do I have recourse? That's a critical ethical notion, the ability to get recourse, to have something reevaluated or redress in the case where I am unjustly harmed by an algorithmic decision system. So how do we translate those things into practical terms? How do we circulate industry standards? Because governance is, of course, not just law and regulation. It's also the social norms by which industries operate and by which we all operate. How do we fix organizational incentives? I mean, we've seen this a lot, right? It's not as though people set out to build sexist resume screeners at Amazon. It's that the organizational incentives did not give them any reason to try and do better. And so how do we change organizational incentives and fix things in that way? How do we have partnerships? How do we work with communities on co-design, co-evaluation, co-everything? How do we actually make this, which of course ties back to the organizational incentives. And the point I want to make here is that all of these are multifaceted. They all should be done in parallel. right? These are not, it's not like there's no magic bullet here. And critically, these occur across the whole pipeline. Design to data collection, to development and analysis, to deployment, use, revision. Every single one of these is one where we're going to need to change the way we do things. We need a sort of holistic approach in terms of all of the changes that we make. I will also mention, this is the one of the four where we've actually had demonstrated improvements. People have actually shown that you can do better if you use these kinds of tools, if you change the processes and practices, if you change the education and training in particular ways. Nobody has yet been able to show that introducing principles into an organization leads to more ethical AI. There's not yet even a case study that has shown that. It's only through these that we're actually making a difference. So really quickly, I just want to say, I called out the blueprint as, hey, look at these principles, ha, ha, ha. I will also mention that there's something called the playbook that accompanies the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Those are the 3 pages of text just for one of the principles in the blueprint. You shouldn't be able to read those, don't worry about it. That's not the point. The point is actually that the playbook tries to set out all of the ways in which we need to be changing everything we do, from training to education, to design, to development, to testing, if we want to have safe and effective systems. And there's similar sorts of things for all of these. So I think there's a recognition that we can't just change one thing. We need to be changing all of it, but it needs to be guided by thinking about what are the basic ethical principles and concepts, and how do we translate those, and recognizing that that translation is going to require new research. Me sitting in my armchair going, yeah, it seems like this will work, is not. And that's where design and the design thinking is absolutely critical. Because what you all are used to doing, hey, it seems like this ought to work, but maybe I should test it, is a kind of translational research. And it's exactly the kind that I think we need to be bringing in. And a lot of the stuff on the previous slide, I should say, is absolutely done by people in design schools or information schools or these kinds of things. And so in that sense, it may be familiar, but you know, I just want to emphasize, we shouldn't actually use the word ethical AI. We should, it's just AI. It's either, it either implements the right values or the values we didn't want, right? And what we need to do is rethink all of our practices. We really need this translational research to fix things. So thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you for that. Of course, if you have a question, pop your hand up and I'll run over to you. But let me start it off here, because I think there is a little bit of what you're saying, you know, preaching to the choir, because a lot of us are designers and we think about human values. And I guess I'm wondering, what does one need to know about the world? Because the world is a complex, rich space of very different people with very different values, and one cannot know everything about the world. But what should one know, and how deep should we be thinking about whatever it is that we're designing or developing when we get out there? That's to start us off, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, it's the perennial problem with any project, right? You can always be asking, further out, okay, but how might this impact those people? How might it impact those people, right? And so there's always the question of where you draw those kinds of boundaries, because you have to if you're going to do anything at all. So I think the starting point is to think about who is most likely to be most impacted. And to make sure when you ask yourself that question, you do not assume that you know, because you are not the impact. Just as we always say, you are not your user. You as the designer or the developer of a system are often not the person who's most impacted. So, but nonetheless, we are also all humans who live in the world. And so I think that the first questions that one needs to ask is to have a sort of open mind and appropriate humility, epistemic humility about what you don't know, and to say, all right, who is most likely to be most impacted? When you start to, in many cases, I think that's going to be kind of obvious, right? Who's most likely to be most impacted about a loan approval decision? Well, the most likely to be most impacted are the people who are applying. Now, of course, other people in their community are also going to be impacted. Their family members might be impacted, all these kinds of things. But start with those folks and actually ask them what their values are. Don't assume that they're going to be able to explicitly tell you, because people are bad at articulating what their own values are. And then use that to guide the design of the system. use that to guide the data collection that you do. Because now you have an understanding of the ways in which what you're doing might significantly harm people, right? Most of the bad cases that I put up there arose because of ignorance, because people didn't even ask the questions in the first place. Now, when do you stop asking the questions? That's going to be a pragmatic decision. Do I need to go and talk to people who are in the community, in the neighborhood, but will never apply for a loan? I wish I could give you a rule of like, here's how you do it. I think rather the way to think about it is extending that humility sort of over time. So you say, okay, I've understood what matters to this group, and they're the most likely to be impacted, I think. So I'm going to start designing and building and developing and deploying with them in mind, but I'm also going to monitor, right? So there is a kind of, build it and forget it mindset in technology right now, where you build something, you toss it out into the world, and you're on to the next project. And I think it's critical that we make sure that we have monitoring systems in place, that we are regularly asking what happened. I actually don't fault, some people may find this sort of an awful thing to say. I actually don't fault a lot of the bad things that have happened in terms of bias and unfair uses. I actually think there are any number of cases where I'm not sure we could have known just how bad it would be before we deployed. We could have wondered, and so we should have been monitoring along the way and figured it out a lot faster. But as you said, the world's a messy, complicated place, and I think we need to be willing to deploy and monitor rather than deploy and forget. So I know that's not a satisfactory answer, and I wish I could give sort of a nice, clean, here's what an ethicist tells you to do. The problem is that, as you said, the world's messy. So, yeah.
Let's get into some questions. I saw a hand over here. Oh, good. You got another mic.
Hello. Thank you for that talk. That gave me a lot of words for things that are different than the words I would usually use for things, but are helpful for problems I'm very concerned with. So I'm very excited about this kind of translational framing and starting with the complexity. And I was trying to think about a concrete example. So like in San Diego, sorry to anyone who knows this is like the thing that I always like talk about, but it's like the city of San Diego bought this like gigantic smart street light system, right? And so how in this model do we understand what ethical principles are important to kind of translate into the design, deployment, configuration, and oversight of the system? And as I was thinking about that, I was like, is this like an ethical question, or is this a political question that's informed by ethics? And since you're a philosopher, I just really wanted to know what you would say about that, because I was not trained in political theory per se. I just kind of learned it all in the streets. So does my question make sense? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so the first thing to say is, so the way I think about at least political theory, political science, as opposed to the actual stuff, how politics works, which, DC, for example, is a very strange place to spend time. But politics is in some ways, it's about how do we collectively come to decisions that we can all implement and abide by, even though we do not all endorse or support them, right? So how do we get to a decision that it's like, I can go, all right, look, I understand that we are collectively going to do this thing. It is not what I want, but nonetheless, I will support and back it because it is what was achieved through the political process. Okay, so that's how I think about politics, or what it should be, is it's about how do we reach a kind of collective endorsement without individual preference. Right? And the reason I distinguish that is because I think that then that's useful to think about the distinction between ethics and politics, because ethics is then about very much, it's about the individual, but acknowledging that the individual is in part defined by socially constructed and socially constituted identities. Okay, so I'm not saying ethics is individualistic, we never need to think about community. Part of who I am, and so part of my values are grounded in my identity as members of various communities, this community, for example, and so forth. So there is that connection between it, because politics is about involves getting from a bunch of incompatible individual preferences and values to a collective. And ethics is about, in part, those individual values are grounded in the collective identity. Okay. So with that as background, what should have happened in the disaster that was the smart streetlight issue, or the disaster that was the use of predictive policing algorithms in the city of Pittsburgh, which I was present for, not involved in. But boy, I got a lot of phone calls when it came out that they had spent 2.5 years with a deployed predictive policing system without publicly disclosing that. Which is why there was promptly a city council ruling that said, no, you can't do that, except it had loopholes. But anyway, that's the politics part of it, is how do you get that? So what should have happened? What should have happened is there should have been broad community engagement. There should have been an understanding of the ways in which, on the one hand, there is some trade-off between security considerations and values and privacy considerations and values. But it's not a sharp trade-off. These are not incompatible. Privacy and security are not incompatible values, despite what Palantir wants to tell you. And so we should have had an understanding of the ways in which that varies across the community. There should have been additional weight placed on the more vulnerable members of the population. For example, if you're going to use this and look for outstanding arrest warrants, those are going to be disproportionately people of color and unhoused, and those are often the more valuable. More valuable also, more vulnerable, right? And so it isn't the case that everybody's values count the same, right? And these things are things, so you don't have to publicly disclose every little detail about the algorithm, right? But you should be publicly disclosing the values that inform and are advanced by the technologies. Right? And I think that's a distinction that often gets lost. People will say things like, look, the TSA can't tell us how they identify people as potential terrorists, because if they told us, people would know how to circumvent. And I go, that's right. But you know what they could tell us? They could tell us what values informed the algorithm that they're using every time somebody buys a plane ticket. They could tell us what values inform the algorithms that determine who gets selected for additional screening. Right? That's information that could be provided, because if you tell me what the values are, then I can't game the system just from that information alone. And if you, TSA, can't tell me what those values are, that's a problem. Because that means you haven't done the work of actually engaging with communities to figure out what is it we're trying to achieve, what is it we're trying to advance. So I think that that's the sense of, even if we couldn't have done co-design, or the city of San Diego could not have done co-design for it, there needed to be a lot of co-engagement. And even if it's not saying to communities, I'm not advocating that communities should have somehow had a veto power. I'm not saying that it's like, oh, maybe it should have, but I'm saying, I saw the eyes go up, sorry. Maybe there should have been communities who had a veto power, right? But I think at the very least, there needed to be engagement, there needed to be an understanding, right, of what are the likely impacts on communities? How does it change things? Now, part of it is also, I think, there's in that particular case, at least as I understand it, though I may be going out on a limb here that can't support me. Part of the challenge is that there was an uneven distribution of knowledge about what could and couldn't be done, such that even if there'd been community engagement, it may not have been it may not have been the kind that needed to happen. So yeah, no, I think it's it's difficult. But it's what we ought to aim for. And I will also say, because sometimes people say, well, yeah, but isn't this terrible? I mean, it's going to take so much time to do this kind of thing. It's just going to be awful. I hear this a lot from data scientists and computer scientists. It's going to be so much extra effort. It's like, all right, first of all, no, it's not. Right? That's part of the reason to focus on practices, is because if we can come up with better practices, you can just do it right the first time. And you don't have to go back and revise it. Your CEO is not getting called in front of Congress. And there's a lot of evidence, actually, around design, that improved design leads to lots of benefits for companies. Right? So the first thing is, it's not actually that much harder to do. It has long-term benefits. And more importantly, I think, is emphasizing that they're already making these decisions. They're just doing it badly, right? They're just doing it without thinking. They're doing it because, I can figure this out. And we, as a community, as a computer science community, we learned 20 years ago what a terrible idea that is in user interface. So I am old enough to have had a computing job where interface design was, I was a coder and I was told, I just come up with something. It was terrible. I am not a user interface person. I don't know what I'm doing. I built something that worked for me, right? And I mentioned that saying, you are not your user, right? Nowadays, a company would be laughed at if somebody showed up and it was like, yeah, we don't bother with a UX person, right? Every team has UX people integrated. And so one question that I would pose is, how do we get to some beautiful utopian future 15 years from now where every team just has designers and ethicists as part of it? And you'd be laughed at as a company if you didn't have a designer and ethicist on your team, on your product team. There are companies trying to do this right now. Most notably, Salesforce is embedding ethicists with multiple product teams. And I'm sorry, I'm really rambling.
Let's take some, no worries. That's good stuff. Let's hear what people are thinking online. Shristi's been monitoring it, right? Why don't you give us a couple of the questions that are coming through so we get a variety of what we're hearing. Yeah. I want to know what you guys are thinking about.
Yeah, to take a question online, Shreya Sharma is asking, actually building on what you were just talking about, that often the designer or the UI UX researcher on the team that's building this product is the person that you turn to and say, hey, what's the ethics like? How should we be designing this product? So she's asking that most of us in this room are also UI UX designers or technologists, and who don't really have a formal education in ethics. And so how do we quickly kind of equip ourselves with the right skills, potentially, to answer those questions when they're posed to us once they go into the job?
So the quickest thing is, Lily mentioned getting some new terminology for ideas that she already had. The quickest thing is there's a few really nice papers that are out there, one especially by Molly Wright-Steenson, that basically map the terminology of design to the terminology of ethics. Because the quickest thing to do is basically just take what you want to get them to do anyway as a designer and repackage it in ethical language. It's not exactly right, but it's not exactly a one-to-one mapping, but it's close enough that actually, if you're trained in good design principles and design thinking, which I'm sure everyone here is, I look at the faculty members. If you're trained in sort of how to do design thinking correctly, you're already thinking about values and engagement and working with impacted communities and all the things. So in some sense, you're already 90% of the way to doing it with the right ethical stance. You may not have that language, but the practices are actually remarkably similar. How do you get to that last 10%? That's the education and training piece that we're missing. In some sense, the focus has been on bridging the massive gaps between, say, computer science and ethics, or data science and sociology. Those are the kinds of large jumps that we're trying to make right now. But we need to have, better training of, all right, how do we get that last 10% for design folks to really understand how an ethicist approaches a problem? And how do we get the ethicists to understand the design thinking? Because most of them I show design thinking, they go, oh yeah, that just makes sense. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but you don't have, ethicists don't have the design terminology, so it goes both ways. Maybe there's a class in the future.
Go back to
Okay, another question here is, how do we design policy to keep up with the pace of technology?
We don't. I mean, I'm sorry, but to be really, we don't. You don't write policy that keeps up with the pace of technology. The technology moves way too fast for the time scale of policy. Just to get a blueprint for a Bill of Rights took 18 months, and that was with a really motivated group at OSTP. That's Suresh Venkat. I always mess up his last name, and I apologize for that. I'll apologize to him again. It takes an enormous amount of time. That being said, we already have a lot of policy on the books. the regulation and policy around healthcare technologies, including apps, it's already on the books. FDA and HIPAA do an enormous amount. They cover huge amounts of what matters when we're talking about healthcare AI. Financial regulation and the SEC have an enormous amount of power and authority over financial technology. It's consumer technologies. That's where we lack it. And that reflects upon the fact that we lack regulation for consumer products more generally in the United States, by and large. So I actually think that the challenge is not to have policy keep up with technology, it's to have policy that's in some sense tech-proof. Right? It doesn't need to keep up because it focuses on the outcomes. It focuses on keeping people safe. It focuses on, right? I mean, pharmaceutical approvals doesn't try and keep up with, do we have mRNA vaccines or other kinds of vaccines? It's just like, here's what we care about. And they're value-centered. So that's the real key, is to have our regulation and policy be value-centered rather than outcome or tech-centered.
Hello. From a practical point of view, has there been any studies what impact AI is going to have on employment, people's jobs? Thank you.
Has there been any study on it? Yeah, there have been multiple studies. There was I guess, the sort of landmark one that people often point to about 5 years ago was a consensus report from the National Academies that looked very carefully at this issue. The consensus that has largely emerged, with the caveat that I'm not a labor economist, the caveat that what has largely emerged is that very few jobs are actually eliminated by automation. Most jobs have a significant percentage of the work required for the job that can be done by automation. So there's almost no jobs where 100% of it could be automated away. But there are lots of jobs where 90% of it could be automated away, and has been in many cases. And so the challenge that then arises is, I think, twofold. One is, how do we ensure meaningful work and labor opportunities in that 10%? Because the 10% is often the call center person who, when all else fails, with the, those stupid buttons that you have to push on your phone to get through the menus and these kinds of things, the person is stuck with it. Like, there's a reason it got to a human. It's a really hard problem, and somebody's angry by the time they get there. So how do we make this actually fulfilling and useful work is, I think, a hard problem, and train people for those skills, including also, new job categories like managing AI. How do you manage a fleet of AI systems? How do you manage a set of robots on a factory floor? So that's one set of problems. The other thing, though, that I think is important is, and I don't have a good answer to this, but one thing that people have pointed out quite a lot is that the rhetoric around AI, automation, and employment is entirely one of replacement rather than augmentation. So, I mean, I've seen any number of sort of slide decks, pitch decks of, companies that want to bring AI to a company, to some other company, and the AI company invariably says, we will essentially keep your productivity the same and slash your costs. They never say, we'll keep your costs the same and make everybody so much more productive. And of course, what does slash cost means? Fire people, right? I mean, that's a euphemism for firing people. And it's always, how can we do the same thing you're already doing, but with fewer people? It's never, what are the ways in which we can expand or grow? So there actually was a company, I won't name them, but what they did is they basically automated a bunch of stuff, and then they told their employees, our estimate is you should have this amount of time. You can now do pro bono work. We're going to keep everybody employed exactly the same. So the idea was their balance sheet would not go up or down when they did this automation. What it would do is it would free up their employees to be able to do pro bono work, essentially on the company's dime. So they were saying, look, use this time that we've carved out for you with the automation. We're going to keep all of you employed. Use it to do good in the world. It lasted 6 months. And then what started happening is when people left to go to other jobs, employment turnover happens, companies stopped replacing. Right? So sorry to be a downer at 5:10, but these are the challenges. Is how do we get companies to understand that slashing costs is not the only reason to automate. You can use it to enable your company to be able to do things that are better. Right now, none of those incentives are in place, and it's a challenge. I don't have a good answer.
We're going to take one more question, and after that, and I just want to remind the people, if you're taking this class for credit, if you're in the class, scan that QR code or go to tinyurl designjan18, and what's the procedure, Shristi? Just sign your name in, like put your email on that first page. So who's got a really good question to end the day with?
Putting the pressure on.
Yeah, I want to put the pressure on you. Who's got the best question? I'm feeling this guy because you raised your question first, so here we go.
I feel like I'm going to ask a question on behalf of a lot of people right now. With Chat GPT, one of the most talked about things right now. You threw a little bit of shade at it, which was funny about, you put your curriculum through it and it probably wouldn't get an A or C. But what do you see as an appropriate way for students to utilize the technology in the beta phase? And what are the benefits? There's a lot of scarcity around it. What are the benefits and the pros to ChatGPT, and what you see the potential future of it having on academia and other aspects of society?
No, it's a great question. So how should people use ChatGPT? What is a positive benefit of ChatGPT? So positive benefit is for lots of fairly simple questions and high-level summaries, ChatGPT is really good. The downside is I have a colleague who, for curiosity, asked ChatGPT to write a syllabus for their course. And ChatGPT gave him a whole bunch of readings. The person's like, wow, I didn't know this person wrote that paper. I need to go look this up. Every single paper had a real author and was made up. Okay? ChatGPT produces patterns that are like the kind of text that we generate and put on the web, but it is not constrained to actually capture what is there. So people sometimes, I think, over-dramatize this and say, ChatGPT lies all the time. It's a habitual lie. It's a fabulist. It just makes things up. I think that over-psychologizes ChatGPT. It doesn't make stuff up. It doesn't have cognitive states like we do. It's not designed to. It's designed to mirror the patterns in our language as represented on the web. So it is actually good for lots of high-level summaries, though. So if you don't want specific papers, if you just want to know, what is this thing, right? If you typed in, what is AI ethics into ChatGPT, I did that one too, right? It actually gives a pretty reasonable answer. One way to think about it is, I think many of the things ChatGPT produces are approximately at the level of what you'd get from a decent newspaper article. Right? It can give you pretty good high-level summaries of things, say in the a science section of a newspaper. Now, Wikipedia does that too, right? So I don't think that ChatGPT is some unique thing. It's just more fun to work with, and you can ask follow-up questions, right? I can't ask follow-up questions of Wikipedia. I have to jump and guess. Well, wait, is this going to be the link that's going to get me to the thing I care about? So the nice thing about ChatGPT, the good thing about it, is this interactive ability. The challenge is it doesn't tell you, and it doesn't have there's no representation of this internally. It doesn't tell you when it's moving into the I'm making stuff up part of the landscape. All right, so the tricky thing for a student is if you use it to get an idea of who are some of the people I should be reading, or what does it even mean to talk about, hermeneutic challenges, right? ChatGPT is fine for that, and you can ask it some follow-up. But you start asking it too many follow-ups, and it's going to drift into just making stuff up.
It's a great means.
It's an excellent means to an end to start to understand, right? I find this all the time when I'm doing research. What should I be reading? Well, I don't want to know which papers. I don't care. What are the keywords I put into Google Scholar, right? That's what I need to know. ChatGPT is great for that kind of thing. And so I think it can be transformative in good ways. Now, the fundamental problem is people say, all right, how do we get it to stop lying? And the answer is, A, completely change the training data because it's getting it off the web, and B, you have to completely change the architecture. Right? There's no way for OpenAI to quickly change GPT to make it so it doesn't make stuff up. It's not like there's a bit flip that they can do that suddenly it'll work.
Can I add something that speaks to that notion? Because this whole series is about creativity. And what's interesting, I think, about ChatGPT is that, you know, it's okay if it's lying to me. Like, give me a poem, you know, write a poem for me, write this thing for me. You know, if you're doing fiction, if you're, you know, coming up with creative ideas, it doesn't matter where they're coming from. I think that's where it's really interesting and transformational, is that it's augmenting how we create. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the place where, and I guess, you know, you raised in terms of students, if we think societally, I mean, I think the real power of ChatGPT, of DALL-E, which is, you know, the image one, and the others, leaving aside all of the issues with intellectual property and all the other things that are problematic about how some of these are being built and trained. I think the real power is that it opens new possibilities. I'll end with one last story, if I may, and that is the story of AlphaGo. Many of you may know, AlphaGo, it's the Go system that DeepMind built that ended up beating Lee Sedol, the #2. And of course now we have AlphaZero, which just destroys AlphaGo. I mean, AlphaZero is so much better than any human player. It's not even, they don't even bother with these competitions anymore. But the thing that I wanted to highlight is two things. First, one of the notable things is that AlphaGo made a move in, I think, game 2 or 3, that the DeepMind programmers, they thought it was a bug. They thought something went wrong with their code because it made no sense. And they went back and they investigated, and they're like, no, actually it meant to do this. And they discovered after a couple of weeks of analysis by humans that actually it was an ingenious new move. That in all the years of centuries of people playing Go, there was this sort of principle that nobody had figured out and that AlphaGo had identified and had taken advantage of. And what that leads to is the second piece, which is, I told you they don't even bother with AlphaZero versus human players. They also don't bother with AlphaZero versus AlphaZero plus human players. And that's because AlphaZero plus a human player beats AlphaZero. So human-machine collaboration in the game of Go still beats the machine. So it's, machine beats human, but put them together and have them work together in a collaborative way. Have to work together in the right way, but you put them together in the right way, they beat the machine. And I think that's maybe the biggest moral, is to think about these things not as replacement, to the extent that we can, but as how can we build augmented collaboratives? How do we do more and do things that we never would have dreamed we could by working together? But that means thinking about what matters to us and how do we get the machine to support that? And that's tough. That needs design and ethics.